They weren't daring explorers or extreme thrill seekers. These 6 individuals attempted simple ideas they believed were harmless. From backyard stunts to homemade pranks, each setup could have been avoided. Yet all of them ended in a silent outcome no one anticipated. It was February 7th, 2016, near Leadville, Colorado. The ski area had already started shutting down for the season, and only a few maintenance workers were still around. 2 friends in their mid-20s, Evan Carter and Logan Price, arrived late in the afternoon. Evan worked short warehouse contracts during winter, while Logan filmed small outdoor clips for fun, hoping one day a video might gain traction online. They recorded each other walking past the half-empty parking lot, their breath showing in the cold air. Light was already slipping behind the ridge. Most lifts stood idle. A chain with a bright closed sign hung across the main access, and a rope barrier stretched across the loading area. They looked around, saw no staff nearby, and stepped over it. Logan lifted his phone toward the empty line, framing the shot like a final ride challenge before the mountain fully closed. They reached a chair hanging low enough to grab. Working together, they pulled it down and climbed on. The system, still powered for maintenance rotation, carried them uphill even though it was flagged offline. They filmed as they rose higher, the air getting colder. Below them, the slope was covered in rough, compacted snow, layered from repeated freeze cycles. Midway up, the chair shook and stopped. A metallic click echoed along the cable. Then silence followed. No engine hum, no motion. They waited, expecting someone to restart the line. Nothing moved. Cold wind pushed against the chair, making the cable groan. The sun dropped behind the ridge, and the temperature fell sharply. After some time, Evan detached his phone from a small tripod and looked down the slope. He shifted forward and pushed himself over the front bar. He dropped around 22 feet, landing hard on a bank of frozen snow. A clear impact crack sounded across the slope. He rolled and clutched his leg. Blood began spreading across the surface, dark against the ice, coming from a deep fracture near his thigh. His phone, still recording, lay at an angle in the snow facing uphill. Logan stayed in the chair, calling down to him. Wind pushed the sound, but the audio captured his breathing turning quick and uneven. Evan tried to move, but lost strength, blood freezing in thin layers across the ground. Logan attempted to place an emergency call, but his phone battery failed in the cold before the call connected. The screen went black. Far down the slope, a snow groomer passed once. Its operator later stated he saw the lift was dark and assumed no one was riding it. He heard a distant voice, but dismissed it as sound carrying through the valley. Night had fully set in. Logan stayed seated, his body stiffening as frost formed across the chair. Evan lay on his side in the snow, arm tightened across his chest. The temperature continued to drop without interruption. At that elevation, night temperatures drop fast once the sun disappears, especially in February. By morning, maintenance workers inspecting the lift found Logan still upright in the chair, body coated in frost with his hands locked around the bar. Evan was found several yards downslope, partially frozen into the snow with a thin crust of ice where the blood had spread and hardened. Both were later confirmed to have died from a combination of hypothermia and blood loss. It was October 29th, 2017, in a small neighborhood in Pennsylvania. Houses were decorated for Halloween, and several residents had set up lawn displays for passing kids. Mark Halper, a 31-year-old hardware store clerk, had turned his front yard into a walk-through scare setup using plywood walls, orange lights, and fake blood. He had a habit of building props from leftover materials from his job, and this year he wanted something louder and more intense than his previous displays. For the final part of his setup, he planned to jump out from behind a wooden sheet while holding a chainsaw. Instead of using a gutted prop tool like the year before, he brought out a real gas-powered chainsaw from his garage. He had removed the chain guard earlier in the day, believing the exposed chain made it look more real than the plastic prop he used the year before. His girlfriend stood near the porch steps with a bucket of stage blood and a speaker playing looping screams to sell the effect. A group of teenagers had already gathered at the sidewalk, holding their phones up to record. Mark started his routine by pacing along the edge of his porch in an old latex mask and stained coveralls. The chainsaw engine roared as he pulled the cord, and the crowd reacted to the sound. He stepped down toward the yard, letting the engine idle loud enough to echo across the street. The ground was wet from light rain earlier that afternoon, and damp leaves from nearby trees were spread across the walkway. As he made his way forward for the jump scare moment, his foot slid on a cluster of slick leaves. The sudden shift in weight sent him off balance. The running chainsaw tilted inward toward his leg. With no guard in place, the exposed chain struck deep into the inside of his thigh. The contact was fast and forceful, cutting directly along the inner leg, where the femoral artery runs close to the surface. Blood immediately pushed through the costume fabric in high bursts. The bright red stains blended with the fake blood already splattered across the prop walls, making it look staged at first glance. A teenager recording from the sidewalk kept filming, zooming in, thinking it was part of the act. Mark dropped the chainsaw, but it remained running on the ground, the engine sputtering against the pavement and spraying small bits of leaf and fabric from the spinning chain. His girlfriend rushed toward him, recognizing the movement wasn't part of their rehearsal. She shouted for help, but several people near her hesitated, assuming it was part of the performance. Some laughed nervously, phones still raised. Mark collapsed onto the driveway, blood flowing rapidly down the slight slope and pooling near the edge where the pavement met the street. A neighbor across the road later stated she initially thought it was a clever, fake collapse until she saw the pool spreading wider than any store-bought prop could mimic. By then, someone had finally rushed in to kick the chainsaw aside and kneel next to him. A call was made for an ambulance, and a couple of people tried pressing on the wound using parts of his costume and prop fabric, but the bleeding was too strong to control. His body went limp during the attempts, and chest compressions were started on the pavement out of urgency rather than clear instructions. The chainsaw remained on its side nearby, engine still running weakly as the chain continued to turn in slow rotations against the wet pavement. When responders arrived minutes later, he showed no reaction. He was confirmed to have died at the scene from rapid blood loss after the chain cut through his femoral artery. It was April 12, 2015, on the outskirts of Newark, New Jersey. An old construction site sat behind a rusted fence, partly overgrown with weeds and littered with scattered concrete slabs. A 19-year-old community college student named Kyle Mercer, known among a small circle of local skaters for filming night clips in urban locations, entered the area with two friends after dark. They looked for new spots to film tricks under the streetlights that flickered across the property. They slipped through a bent section of fence and walked along the unfinished pavement. One of them taped a phone to a metal rail using black electrical tape, angling it to catch a grind attempt. The phone's flashlight was left on, casting a narrow beam across a stretch of cracked concrete. Near the edge of the frame, a dark trench cut across the ground. From above, it looked like a shallow dip filled with rainwater, reflecting a faint glimmer from the streetlight. Kyle stepped back for speed while the others moved beside the rail. The camera's light reflected off the wet surface, flattening the depth and making the opening appear shallow. With enough momentum for a jump, he pushed off his board and aimed to clear the gap. Instead of hitting solid ground, he dropped straight down. The trench was actually a vertical utility shaft, leading to a drainage access tunnel roughly 25 feet below the surface. The sound of his board clattering against the concrete edge, followed by a heavy impact, echoed upward. The audio captured a sharp thud as his body struck the lower landing. His legs folded awkwardly, and the phone taped to the rail caught only the top edge of the shaft and the sudden jolt of his board flipping out of frame. His friends rushed to the edge, looking down through the darkness. They could hear shallow gasps from below, but saw little beyond the faint light of his fallen board's small LED. They argued about calling for help, worried about being caught trespassing on a restricted site. Minutes passed with no clear decision, until one of them tried climbing down using metal rungs embedded in the wall of the shaft. A night security guard patrolling a nearby lot later reported hearing the sound of metal hitting concrete along with distant voices, but he believed it was just scavengers moving through the area for scrap. He did not approach the site. By the time one of the friends reached the bottom, Kyle was slumped against a lower step built into the shaft wall, breathing in short, uneven bursts. The other two hesitated at the top, still unsure whether to involve emergency services. His breathing slowed and eventually stopped while they remained in the shaft, unsure what to do next. They backed out before dawn, leaving the phone still taped to the rail and the board lying near the edge. When maintenance crews arrived in the morning for routine inspection, they found Kyle positioned upright against the concrete step, his body partially twisted from the fall. The phone above continued recording until its battery died sometime during the night. He was later confirmed to have died from impact trauma and untreated injuries sustained in the fall. It was December 3rd, 2018, in a frozen parking lot outside a bar near Duluth, Minnesota. The temperature had dropped into the low 20s, and a thin crust of ice covered the pavement. Snowbanks from earlier plowing lined the edges of the lot, some piled higher than the parked cars. Ryan Keller, a 28-year-old office worker, had attended a small reunion gathering inside. By around 2 a.m., most of the group had dispersed, scraping frost from their windshields and idling their cars before heading out. Ryan made his way to his sedan parked near the back edge of the lot, where a snowbank had been pushed up nearly level with his rear bumper. Instead of leaving, he got inside and started the engine to let the heater run. The exhaust pipe was pressed close to the packed snow, partially sealing the outlet without fully covering it. As the heater circulated warm air, condensation began to fog the windshield from the inside, spreading in uneven streaks across the glass. From outside, only shifting patterns of moisture were visible across the windows. With the cabin sealed shut and the heater running, exhaust trapped by the snowbank began to gather underneath the vehicle, feeding carbon monoxide back into the ventilation system through gaps in the floor and ducting. The gas built up inside the cabin without any odor or visible sign. Carbon monoxide gradually replaced oxygen in the enclosed space, based on how CO exposure progresses in confined environments. Ryan would have lost awareness within minutes as the level in the bloodstream increased. Around 3:15 a.m., another group left the bar and crossed the lot. They noticed Ryan's car still idling with its taillights on and windows fogged over. Seeing no movement through the frost-covered glass, they assumed he was letting the heater run before driving home and continued walking. As the night continued, the thin film of condensation on the interior windows cooled and began to freeze. Frost formed along the edges of the windshield and slowly expanded inward, making the glass appear hazy and opaque. The muffled idle of the engine could still be heard near the back of the lot, dulled further by the packed snow around the exhaust. By 4 a.m., the car appeared no different from any other vehicle left running to stay warm in freezing conditions. Interior visibility was almost fully obscured by frost. Carbon monoxide continued to accumulate inside, while fresh air never entered the sealed cabin. At some point, all movement inside the car stopped. The engine continued running for hours. Without body heat, the interior temperature dropped again, causing frost to spread until most of the windows were coated in a pale layer of ice. From a distance, the car looked like someone had simply fallen asleep while waiting for the cabin to warm up. Around sunrise, a staff member from the bar stepped outside to check the lot before leaving. Ryan's car was still idling in the same place, the windows sealed with frost. When the staff member went closer and looked through the glass, he saw Ryan slumped in the driver's seat, unresponsive. The door was open, but there was no reaction. He had already died from carbon monoxide exposure caused by exhaust blockage and gas buildup inside the sealed vehicle. It was July 9th, 2016, in Bakersfield, California, where weekend heat pressed down on quiet residential streets. In one of the backyards, a temporary filming setup had been arranged using foldable camping tables, 2 tripods, and a used industrial water tank positioned in the center of the lawn. The stunt was planned by Luke Carter, a 24-year-old amateur performer who had been posting small magic tricks online in hopes of gaining an audience. His previous uploads showed minor escape attempts using ropes and plastic cuffs, but this was his first time involving a fully enclosed water tank. The tank had originally been designed for agricultural storage and still had faded manufacturer markings on its base. Luke had cleaned it earlier in the afternoon and drilled a small air hole near the cap, saying it would prevent a pressure lock. The hose water inside remained slightly cloudy from residual tank dust. Two friends, both familiar with his videos but not trained in rescue or stunt coordination, were assigned to operate the cameras. They stood on opposite sides of the yard to capture two angles for a future edit. The setup looked informal, with no safety mats, medical supplies, or backup tools apart from a basic toolbox left open on the ground. Before climbing the ladder, Luke cuffed his hands in front of him using a pair of metal restraint cuffs and secured his wrists further with thick zip ties. He planned to snap the ties underwater as a show of strength and then push upward against the lid for a dramatic exit. The lid was not designed for rapid removal and had a rubber lining meant to seal against liquid leaks when used for farm chemicals. The friends noted that it sat tighter than expected during a quick test, but no further adjustments were made. The tank was filled to the top, causing the surface tension to press directly against the lid once it was set in place. Luke lowered himself into the water, submerging until his head disappeared and only a few air bubbles drifted up. The lid was placed, and it shifted slightly, creating a full seal. The drilled air hole was immediately overwhelmed by a thin layer of water clinging to the cap's surface, blocking airflow completely. Inside the tank, the temperature drop and sudden pressure change caused Luke to twist his shoulders and attempt to press upward. The movement produced rapid bursts of bubbles that struck the lid in short, rhythmic pulses. From outside, it appeared like an intense performance moment meant to heighten drama. His legs kicked against the base, sending vibrations through the plastic. The friends continued recording, adjusting their camera angles rather than assisting. They later described the knocking sound as sharp and metallic due to echo inside the tank structure. A neighbor watering plants adjacent to the fence heard the impacts, but assumed someone was playing a diving game in a pool. The water inside the tank began to settle as the movements became less forceful. Only small ripples remained at the surface, spreading out and fading in seconds. When several long moments passed without any further movement, one of the friends finally stepped forward and tried to lift the lid. The suction held it firmly in place. He called to the other camera operator to help, and both pulled against the top, their hands slipping on the wet plastic. They located the screwdriver in the open toolbox and wedged it into the seam, forcing air to rush in with a hollow pop. The lid came free suddenly, and water sloshed over the sides. Luke's body drifted upward until his shoulders broke the surface. His face was pale, eyes partially open, and his arms floated outward with no resistance. One friend jumped into the tank water and hauled him out awkwardly over the edge, dropping him onto the grass. His chest showed no visible movement. Basic chest compressions were attempted on the uneven lawn without checking for a pulse. The compressions caused water to expel from his mouth in short bursts. Emergency services were called several minutes after the tank was opened. Paramedics arrived and continued resuscitation efforts using proper airway tools and a portable oxygen unit. Luke was transported to a nearby hospital where staff continued attempts to restore a heartbeat. Despite multiple cycles of CPR and assisted ventilation, no cardiac activity returned. He was officially pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The tank remained in the backyard, still half filled, with cameras left running until their batteries drained. The water inside was still and clear, showing no signs of disturbance after the final struggle ended. It was October 31st, 2017, in a residential suburb of Salem, Oregon. Most houses had front yard displays set up for trick-or-treating, and plastic decorations lined the sidewalks. In one yard, a full-sized wooden coffin stood out from the rest of the displays. It belonged to Mark Ellison, a 34-year-old grocery store employee known among co-workers for building homemade props each year. He had told a co-worker, Daniel Reeves, that he would be setting up something worth seeing and that Daniel could stop by the next morning before their shift to check it out in daylight. Mark had spent several nights building the coffin from plywood, reinforcing the lid with metal brackets and reusing an old latch taken from a storage trunk. The latch was automatic and clicked shut once the lid was lowered. A Bluetooth speaker, hidden near the porch, played looping haunted audio tracks, including faint knocking sounds and dragging noises. A bowl of candy sat on top of the coffin to draw kids closer before the planned jump scare. Mark entered the coffin at dusk, to be in place before visitors arrived, and pulled the lid shut. The latch locked, sealing the interior. No ventilation holes were drilled, and the wood fit tightly at the seams, restricting airflow. Investigators later noted scrape marks on the interior of the lid and sides, suggesting he attempted to force it open from inside. The limited air volume inside the coffin, combined with rising carbon dioxide, would have caused rapid breathlessness in the confined space. Early signs of distress likely included increased breathing rate and physical agitation, leading to repeated impacts against the lid. The coffin's audio effects masked the thudding sounds, and passing visitors assumed the vibrations were part of the display. A neighbor later reported hearing dull tapping but dismissed it, believing it came from the speaker system. As the night went on and foot traffic slowed, no one approached the coffin closely. The speaker battery eventually drained, silencing the background noise. The yard grew quiet, and the coffin remained in place without movement. The scrape marks and pressure marks on the interior walls indicated that the last attempts to escape were made with weakening force. Oxygen depletion in sealed spaces of that size can lead to unconsciousness within minutes, especially with elevated carbon dioxide levels contributing to air hunger. By early morning, light frost formed over neighborhood lawns. A neighbor taking down decorations noticed that Mark's display looked unchanged, but assumed he had left it in place intentionally. A garbage collection crew moved along the street shortly after and shifted plastic props closer to the curb for easier pickup. One worker placed a hand on the coffin to slide it aside, but left it when he felt the unexpected weight for something meant to be hollow. Around 8 a.m., Daniel Reeves stopped by as planned, expecting to see Mark outside collecting decorations before leaving for their grocery shift. Most Halloween setups on the street had already been taken down or moved, but Mark's yard remained untouched. The coffin was still sealed shut, standing exactly as it had the previous night. Daniel went to the front door first and knocked several times. He waited, then tried again. There was no movement inside the house. He called Mark's phone, and a faint ringtone sounded from somewhere in the yard instead of inside the house. Following the sound, he found the phone lying face down in the grass near the coffin, partially covered by damp leaves. The screen was still active, showing multiple missed calls. With no sign of Mark elsewhere on the property, Daniel returned to the coffin, now treating it as more than just a prop. He placed a hand on the lid, expecting it to shift like a lightweight display piece, but the latch resisted. The lid felt sealed tight, and a thin layer of moisture along the edge suggested it had not been opened since nightfall. The weight distribution was also off, heavier toward the head section, unlike an empty prop. Daniel stepped back and contacted emergency services. Paramedics arrived and used a pry tool to force the latch open. When the lid gave way, a rush of cold interior air escaped. Mark was inside, positioned against the lid, with dried scrape patterns visible on the inner wood near arm height. He was lifted out and assessed on the lawn. Rigor mortis had already begun, and no signs of breathing or pulse were present. Paramedics confirmed death at the scene. The coffin stayed in place while investigators photographed the latch, scrape marks, and interior surfaces. The drained speaker was found in the bushes nearby, its battery fully expended. Once documentation was complete, the display was dismantled, leaving only a flattened imprint in the grass where it had stood during the night. Thanks for watching. Did you like the stories? Click more